Andrei, this is just a check. I'm going to do my introduction in Spanish, just to check that Andrei and Catherine can hear me. Okay.
Bueno, pues buenos días a todos y a todas. Son las 10.
Good morning, everybody. It's 1 minute past 10. So we're on time, and thanks to everybody for being here for this very interesting session. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's great to be listening to you. It's a very important subject. These are very important matters. What we're going to be talking about related to Russia, Ukraine, and I want to just make a brief introduction of the three speakers so that our audience can understand a little bit more about the speakers we have today, about their past history, and also I'm going to tell you a little bit about the order in which they'll be speaking. Firstly, we're going to be hearing from Catherine Belton, who was Financial Times correspondent in Moscow between 2007 and 2013. Now she's an investigative journalist for Reuters. In her book that we have here, you've got Catherine Belton. In Spanish it's called Los hombres de Putin como la KGB se apoderó de Rusia y se enfrentó a Occidente, which is a book which has 100 pages for each year that she took to write it, so it's got 700 pages in it, with a series of appendices, with all the documentation. It's incredible, the work that she's done. I'm in chapter 8, although I've skipped through some chapters to get to the end to see the connections between Trump and the Russian mafia. But I recommend it to you. The Economist and the Financial Times and the New Statesman and the Telegraph said it was the book of the year, and the author has been praised. She's also had a few upsets. I think there are 5 outstanding court cases that have been brought by Russian oligarchs related to this book. From what I've read so far, it's a book that's been brilliantly written with a lot of documentation. And if it's not the final work, it is the greatest work to understand how this very dangerous and underrated man, Vladimir Putin, came to power. It's not just a great biography of him, but also it's something that provides us with an explanation of the synchronization and the great way in which Putin is related to the Russian deep state and the relationships at the top of Russian power. I think Catherine has shown quite clearly this that all of this isn't the product of a failed democracy in the capitalist system, but rather a state that was already mafia-based and criminal in the Soviet era, and has just continued now, and it's just become a criminal organization, and the KGB just is funding operations around the world. I don't want to spoil your enjoyment of this book, but I think it's a great book, very enjoyable. And people say that journalism is the first draft of history. Here we've got a great draft, and I think that many historians, when they use these sources in the future, will be able to get more information than this information. It's really a key work. So thanks to Catherine for her work and for the risk involved in writing these kind of books. We've also got Carmen Claudine with us. She's a senior researcher at CIDOB, where she was a deputy director as well. She studied philosophy at Sorbonne in Paris. She's an expert in Russian and Soviet history. Her book on Lenin, the Cultural Revolution, has been translated into English and Spanish. She's very much committed to the change and democratization processes, not just in Central Asian republics, but more specifically recently in Belarus and Ukraine. And with her connections with the opposition and civil movements, I've known her for many years, and I've actually been able to profit from her knowledge. I've been to Ukraine with her. She's been key to helping leaders from the Belarusian and Ukrainian opposition here, and she's been able to help us in Spain get to know more about this very unknown reality of these republics, because it would seem that we know little about them. Her three most recent articles in the El País, a newspaper, and he's giving the names of them, these articles in Spanish. I recommend you read them. And finally, we've got Andrei Kolesnikov. Andrei is also a very important person at the moment. He's a fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He's a very excellent journalist. He's received several journalism awards. He contributes to Gazeta.ru and Forbes.ru. He's been managing editor of Novaya Gazeta and sub-director of Ivestia and the Times. He has working on how we can understand how these deep currents affect public opinion in Russia. And he is currently, I feel, a person who is maintaining with all the difficulties. He's one of the few critical voices that remains in Moscow. He's very brave. His most recent articles can be consulted online, but I think they're very revealing titles. The Captives of Putin, Putin the Emperor, The Banality of Putin, Putin Against History is just one of them. There's a Spanish article, an article in Spanish, entitled in Spanish, Partir o no partir, and I recommend that. It's in the May to June edition of this year, 2022, and it's an article which is very lucid, but sad at the same time, in the thoughts that Andrei gets across in the article, where he describes and says that what's happening now in Russia is actually makes me think that it's worse than what happened in the Soviet Union, because before Mikhail Gorbachev, we didn't expect anything. We just lived how we lived. But now, after 30 years of trying to build a normal country, what we've got is a complete failure, complete abolition, not of what used to be done, but of life in general. It's as if it had never existed. And all of this work just of a grey man, this little man who I compared with Mussolini in 2000, and that was the first time that somebody was afraid to publish my article. So Andrei, I think you're a powerful voice to try to understand what is happening inside Russia at the moment. So thank you so much for being here. So without further ado, with this introduction that I thought was necessary, I want to hand the floor over to Catherine. Catherine.
You face all these recurrent myths about Putin, and you taking a lot of time and effort to debunk and to construct the real and the true story of who is Putin, how he got to power. We're very interested in listening about this, but also, of course, about the regime trajectory and what the war has done to the regime, and also how and why the regime, and what is your forecast about how the regime could move on from now. So thank you for being here. We know you make a great effort to be here with us, but we hope to compensate you with at least, the good sides, the good weather and good company. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's a great honor to be here with you today in such beautiful surroundings. Very glad to be here indeed. Thank you, Mr. Borrell, for the invitation. I heard some of the remarks yesterday about how indeed did we get here. A year ago, everyone was discussing Afghanistan. No one could even imagine that we would be facing the crisis that we're facing today. It seemed unimaginable. Everyone is trying to figure out the roots of this crisis. Where did it begin? You could indeed paint a very long trajectory back, perhaps to the time of Vladimir Putin when he was a mid-level KGB officer in Dresden, watching the Berlin Wall collapse, when he faced protesters gathering outside the KGB villa in Dresden, when he and his comrades were busy stuffing the furnace full of documents, trying to destroy all traces of their agent networks to make sure the West couldn't get hold of what they'd been up to in Dresden during that period. He spoke about, in an interview with journalists shortly before his election as president in March 2000, he spoke about how they were stuffing so many papers into the furnace that it nearly burst. He was very worried about the protesters gathering outside. He was so worried he made a call to the nearby Soviet military base where he asked for backup for protection to make sure the protesters couldn't get inside the KGB villa. But in fact, what he heard from the command post was something that stayed with him ever since. He heard the words, we can't do anything without orders from Moscow, and Moscow is silent. And these words just seemed to stay with him from that moment onwards. He couldn't understand it. He said, it seemed like we'd given up our position in Europe. I wanted something different to be proposed in its place, but nothing different was proposed. They'd just given up and walked away. And so ever since Putin came to power in 2000, he has strived to restore Russian empire, its standing on the world stage. And unfortunately for all of us, he hasn't done so by trying to build a vibrant and competitive economy that could raise Russia's standing in that way to compete with the rest of the world, but instead he's done so by reverting to this toolkit of the KGB past. This was a toolkit that was already in operation when he was in Dresden. We saw it, in fact, in action. We saw traces of it in the German Bundestag's own investigations of what the Stasi was up to in those days, when the Stasi was using front companies, when there was a Stasi agent named Martin Schlaf, who later became a key cog in the Gazprom empire of intermediaries in Europe. In the days of Dresden, Martin Schlaf, according to the German Bundestag, was a Stasi agent who was moving money through front companies. He'd been given an enormous contract by the East German government to build a hard disk plant in neighboring Thüringen. It was going to be the most expensive hard disk plant East Germany had ever produced, and yet the plant was never built. He was given contracts to supply components, smuggle them past Western embargoes. None of the components ever arrived. In fact, the money instead was smuggled out into front companies staffed by Stasi agents in Singapore and Liechtenstein. They were preparing then for fall. They were preparing for the end of communism, and they also realized the writing was on the wall for the Eastern Bloc, so they were preparing ways to move their money into companies so that they could survive a transition. And so the tactics of using intermediaries, front companies, fake contracts were all in play in the late 80s when Putin was in Dresden. There is no evidence at the moment that Putin was working with Schlaf then, but Schlaf later became, as I mentioned, a key cog in the Gazprom empire in Austria. It was a key intermediary then. So we saw him using these tactics. We also saw Putin involved in active measures against the West when in those days the Soviets realized, the KGB realized it couldn't compete directly economically or militarily against the West. So instead they resorted to covert underhand tactics to try and disrupt and sow dissent in among their enemies. So Putin then, for instance, was trying to compromise a professor, according to a Stasi agent who later defected to the West. Putin was trying to corrupt and compromise a professor into handing over a recipe to create a poison, a traceless poison, and he tried to do so by planting pornographic material on him. These are tactics that we've gone on to see in Putin's regime. And he was also, according to this same Stasi-era defector, he was also a handler of a notorious neo-Nazi who went on to stoke the rise of the rise of the far right in East Germany. And according to a former member of the Red Army faction, Putin was also meeting with members of the far left terror group in Dresden. And indeed, Dresden was not the backwater that we've come to know it for, but it was in fact a place where members of this far-left terror group were meeting with KGB handlers, with Stasi handlers, where perhaps they weren't receiving instructions per se, but suggestions on future targets. And so we see these tactics of active measures. The word active measures was something that we have forgotten about after the Soviet fall. We all thought the KGB tactics of the past were over. Unfortunately, we since came to remember them ever since Donald Trump's election as president, where once again the Western media is writing about active measures, about Russia's attempts to undermine democracies in the West. So we see this. And unfortunately, so when Putin came to power in 2000, again, he began immediately reverting to this toolkit of the KGB past. Unfortunately, as soon as he came to power, his first task was to take control of the commanding heights of the economy. He put his close KGB-connected allies in charge of strategic sectors of the economy, and he was able to cow the once independent oligarchs of the Yeltsin era. He did so by jailing Russia's richest man at the time in 2003, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, and dismantled and took over his oil company, Yukos. And this meant that every other Yeltsin-era tycoon realized that they could face the same fate if they didn't toe the Kremlin line, if they didn't pledge to follow all orders of the Kremlin, and if they didn't sometimes display their loyalty to the Kremlin voluntarily. And as Putin's allies took over control of strategic sectors of the economy, this allowed them to create slush funds, which were basically kind of pools of black cash, and allowed them to create intermediaries, trading companies such as Gennady Timchenko's Gunvor oil trading company, and Surgut Neftegaz, where the ownership ownership mechanisms were so intransparent, there were a myriad of ways in which money could be diverted. And as they took control of the commanding heights of the economy, the strategic cash flows, they could first use this cash to take political control at home. They were buying elections, paying for state propaganda, and once a critical mass had been achieved over domestic political power, these cash stores, which by then could be deployed through a vast web of offshore ventures abroad, could be used to subvert and undermine Western democracies. For a long time, the West has been complacent about these tactics. It was blind to these tactics, as most of the Western companies, Western banks, and all majors were all seeking to justify the Putin regime as its businesses were trying to hang on to the Kremlin's coattails and join the cash bonanza. So the testing ground for Moscow's expanding influence, for its subversion and its corruption, and the focus of its aggression has always been Ukraine. We've seen this in the 2006 cut-off of gas to Ukraine. We saw the tactics that we're now seeing being used against Europe today. When Russia first cut off gas to Ukraine, it was its first use as energy, as a weapon of political power, and then cutting off the gas supplies to Europe, leading to a sharp shortfall in gas supplies to Europe as well. It basically presented the pro-Western leadership of Ukraine with an offer it couldn't refuse. You can either have your gas supplies remaining cut off, or you can accept this intransparent gas intermediary trader through which we will corrupt you. You probably remember the name of this gas trader. It was called Ukrenergo, and it basically tainted and corrupted the pro-Western leadership of Ukraine, as it was a way of creating kickbacks to pay the Viktor Yushchenko and the pro-Western leadership of Ukraine. It was immediately a corrupt deal, but they were essentially given no choice. They had to accept this deal, and Yushchenko was getting billions every year in profits through this non-transparent gas dealer. The corruption of the pro-Western leadership basically helped ignite the return to power of the pro-Russian Viktor Yanukovych. And you could see clearly these bullying tactics, and in it were lessons for us all. But many of us didn't really want to see this, and then the Russian continued to use the similar type of schemes in Europe. There were many intransparent mechanisms acting as gas intermediaries for gas sales in Europe. In 2006, there was also one deal that was stopped in its tracks by the Italian Parliament, in which Centrogas, the same gas intermediary where Martin Schlaff, the Stasi agent, is a director, was also creating a shady intermediary together with Silvio Berlusconi's closest friend for gas sales for Russia into Italy. And this was a company that was due to make billions of dollars in revenues every year. Its ownership was murky at best. Its part ownership by a close friend of Silvio Berlusconi meant that even the Italian Parliament was up in arms about it, and it managed to stop this deal in its tracks. But this was just one deal, and there are many more that we don't know about, in which Russia's Gazprom may have been used as a mechanism to corrupt and weaken elites here in Europe. There were some journalists and analysts who were shouting about this from the start, like Roman Kuczynski, who spoke about gas traders as intermediaries that could be used as a mechanism to funnel kickbacks into Europe to corrupt and weaken the leadership, but most didn't want to listen. So I think Putin's regime has always been very much focused on Ukraine. They were always consistently believing that Ukraine is crucial to Russia's power. That every now and then Vladimir Yakunin, a close Putin ally, would speak about how Brzezinski in sort of the 90s had spoken about how when without Ukraine, Russia is nothing. And so they consistently believed that the West had plans since the 60s, that the CIA, Yakunin told me of this, that the CIA had had plans since the 60s of trying to extract and pull away Ukraine from Russia as one way of undermining and destroying Soviet power in those days, and they believed that this was continuing to the present day. So it was always very important for Russia to maintain some kind of political control over Ukraine. However, Russia's strong-arm tactics in Ukraine ran out of luck when President Zelensky was elected. Its efforts to corrupt and influence through political allies were also stopped in their tracks. We've heard, of course, about how President Zelensky in 2021 cracked down on one of Putin's closest allies there in Ukraine. This was Viktor Medvedchuk, and Zelensky has even said in a very recent interview with the Washington Post was that if he hadn't come to power, if he hadn't been elected, then probably this pro-Russian party of Viktor Medvedchuk would have been the #1 party in Russia. Medvedchuk is so close to Putin that Putin is godfather to his youngest daughter. And Zelensky has said that if he hadn't been elected, then Medvedchuk would probably be Speaker of Parliament. This would have given him the right to appoint the Ukrainian government, and it would have been a great boon for Russia continuing its control. However, when Zelensky cracked down on Medvedchuk and his political party, when he essentially kind of pulled the propaganda that was being aired on the 4 television stations that were owned by Medvedchuk, by sanctioning Medvedchuk, essentially taking them off the air, essentially he sowed the seeds for what happened today. I think Putin was very upset he'd lost a key tool of influence in Ukraine. He was running out of ways to influence Ukraine politically, to kind of regain a political foothold. So he resorted to the most drastic and desperate gambit of all of them. There was this invasion plan. But we also heard, again in a recent interview of Zelensky with my colleagues at the Washington Post, that essentially he believed that Putin believed that he thought that Zelensky would just drop everything, that he would run away, that the war would take only 3 days, that as soon as the first sight of troops, Zelensky would run to refuge either in the west of Ukraine or out of Ukraine entirely. Of course, Putin only had prior experience to go by because his own pro-Russian ally, Viktor Yanukovych, had run away in 2014 at the first whiff that he wouldn't be supported himself. At the first whiff of violence, Yanukovych had run away. But Zelensky was made of much stronger stuff than this. And I think we've seen here a fatal miscalculation. We have seen Putin had also been convinced that Zelensky was feckless and weak by his own allies like Viktor Medvedchuk and the inner circle of the former Ukrainian president Viktor Yanukovych. They'd all been whispering in his ear, convincing him that Zelensky would fall easily, that as soon as the first troops appeared, that he would just run away. And unfortunately, these were miscalculations on all sides. not just by the Russians, but also by Western governments. They didn't believe that Zelensky would be able to withstand such a show of force, and therefore Western governments did not supply weapons to Ukraine because they believed these weapons would fast fall into Russian hands. So Zelensky has spoken about how the Russians were preparing through these shock tactics, and they were trying to prepare the Zelensky regime for a soft surrender, for a handover. Fatal miscalculations on all sides. And so we've heard from our own reporting that there were FSB squads sent into Ukraine in the first days of the war, and they'd been so confident that they were going to be able to take over Kiev, is that they spent the last few days before the war was launched essentially booking accommodation in Kiev. They were telling their informants to get out of the city, that they should leave for a few days, but leave behind their keys so that they could live in them while the handover of power was arranged. We've heard as well that they also told these FSB informants that after they left, by the time they came back in a few days' time, everything will be different. They were so supremely confident that Zelensky would just agree to hand over power. However, it's clear that not everyone in the Russian elite agreed with this plan. I've been told by a very senior Russian politician who has close ties to the FSB that he did not back any plan involving military force. And he also said neither did everyone in the Kremlin administration. There was a widespread belief in the Kremlin administration itself that people like Medvedchuk were stoking false perceptions, that they'd over-exaggerated their own capabilities of engineering a transfer of power and installing a pro-Russian leadership at the first sign of military might. And this senior Russian politician has said that you could see the lack of alignment, the lack of agreement over this plan in that infamous Security Council meeting that we all watched in the final days before Putin launched the war. You could see it in the fear in the eyes of some of the officials who were being forced to agree to an agenda that they were very clearly uncomfortable with. And what you can see in this decision of Putin is that in his increasingly autocratic regime, there is no adequate feedback system. People feared to tell him the truth, they feared to tell him he was wrong, and they feared, and they only wanted to tell him what he wanted to hear. So you had FSB agents telling him, yes, you can take Ukraine, Zelensky will fall at the first sight of military might. It's now clear to many that Putin's war in Ukraine was a huge mistake. You even hear Gerhard Schroeder speaking about this now, following his recent visit to Putin, that it was indeed a great mistake. But unfortunately, Putin in the last 2 years, in particular in his isolation during the pandemic, he's become consumed by his role in history. He wants to return Ukraine to restore Russian empire, and we've seen the increasing dominance of hardliners like Nikolai Patrushev, the current head of the Security Council, who's been very much a dark force behind the Putin regime ever since Putin came to power in 2000. We've seen his influence. He's a year older than Putin. Very often he's taken decisions and tried to engineer and maneuver Putin into taking some of the most darkest paths that we've seen his regime take. For instance, and also at that Security Council meeting before the war was launched, you essentially saw Patrushev there as the only confident person on the stage. He was there almost telling Putin what to do. He said, we have to defend our sovereignty and territorial integrity. He told Putin that the US had been pushing the Ukrainians down a path towards confrontation and conflict in the east of Ukraine, that nobody wanted this, and essentially he was telling Putin to continue with his war plans. He said, yes, you may continue negotiating with Joseph Biden, but we know that the US has made its decision anyway, so there is no point. But clearly, as we've heard from the senior Russian politician, not everyone is on board with Putin's plans. And this has been clear not just in the social media posts of posts of Russian banker Oleg Tinkov, but who has long been on the outs, who no longer lives in Russia. But it's clear from key insiders, such as Russian billionaire Oleg Deripaska, who is still in Moscow. He has spoken out very, very clearly against the war. He has said, I'm very worried and shocked by the fact that we've abandoned all the achievements of the 90s, all the achievements of the 2000s, and now we're just waiting for victory. Victory for what? He said it would be a colossal mistake to destroy Ukraine, and he also said it's very clear that the sanctions are hurting the Russian economy much harder than they are in the West. However, there are those, I think, in the Russian elite who, after the initial shock of the war, when Putin's role as the guarantor of stability seemed to be completely turned on his head, for many of the Russian oligarchs it was a massive shock because, for the past 30 years they'd been able to, build enormous empires. Putin's role in the last 20 years as the guarantor of stability meant that they turned a blind eye to many of the misdoings of his regime, that they were willing to share their wealth with the Kremlin as long as they continue to earn huge amounts of money and create vast fortunes. However, Putin's war has turned that paradigm on its head. They have, all the millions that they've spent building reputations in the West have now been undermined. They have, many of them felt that their business empires were crashing around them in the first days of the war in February. However, there's been some time for the new reality to sink in. There are some of them who are now, in a typical Russian fashion, perhaps believing they can wing it, that perhaps Russia can redraw the map of global trade as they create new alliances with Turkey, India, and China, that perhaps Russia is in a position to weather the sanctions better than the West. And that Russia can outlast the West as inflation grows here, as energy prices grow, that Russians are tougher and will therefore outlast the West. And perhaps in this crisis, they see an opportunity. However, we're now at a very critical juncture, and it seems to me from all the people that I've been speaking to that the West has to realize it's stronger than that. Putin thinks the West is weaker, that its democracy is weaker, that our leaders here will have to answer to its population as they won't agree to endure the high energy prices and the inflation that sanctions in part have brought. But it seems that Deripaska was right when he said that the sanctions are hitting the Russian economy far harder. We see kind of crucial inadequacies and shortages in supplies of equipment for the metal sector. Various manufacturing sectors have now come to a standstill. And what's critical in the months ahead are, of course, the discussions on a price cap on energy. And this is something that I've heard, including from the Russian economist Sergei Guriev, which could be fatal for the Russian regime's ability to continue funding its war. If there's a price cap at a level of $40–50 per barrel, this means that Russian oil companies can continue to produce oil at a profit, a small profit, so it's unlikely that there would be a big cutback in production, as some Western investment banks such as JP Morgan have warned, but instead what would happen is that Russia will be facing a deep fiscal crisis, because if you introduce an energy cap at these levels, not only do you reduce the inflationary pressures in Western economies, not only will the upwards pressure on energy prices subside, but you are basically going to halve Russia's energy revenues overnight. So this is something that's very important to do. Again, I'm a journalist, so of course I can't give policy recommendations, but it really seems to me that the sanctions effect is beginning to be noticed much more. And I know, of course, too, there is much discussion now around this proposal for a visa ban. Again, I'm a journalist, so I can't give policy recommendations, but there are some influential Russians, for instance, that I have spoken to, who believe that there is a danger, perhaps, in this plan, in that it could allow Putin to convince the Russians that the West is only against Russia, that it's not against the war, and this will allow Putin to consolidate Russian society more hardly against the West, that they'll believe that this is a Western policy targeted only against Russia to keep them out of the West. However, he says that Russians should be given a choice. If you want to travel to the West, you sign a piece of paper saying you're against the war. And this would make it clear to all Russians that this is not because the West is against Russia per se, but because the West is against a war that is killing thousands and thousands of Ukrainians.
Excellent. I think we also have some food for debate. Also, we will also to hear later from Andrei what he thinks about the travel ban and so on. And thanks for such a comprehensive and deep vision and for all the issues you put on the table. Voy a darle la palabra entonces ahora.
I'm going to give the floor to Carmen Claudine. I know that she's well aware of the frustration and the of this, because of the repetition of these kind of situations that are quite damaging on Ukraine. And I know that you address these issues on a daily basis. What do we exactly have to know among these debate on Ukraine? Thank you, Ignacio. Thank you to the university for inviting me. Listening to Catherine, I can say that what she says shows an idea that Alexeyevich said when she accepted the Nobel Prize. She said in the 90s, we lost an opportunity. Shelana Alexeyevich is the Svetlana is the incarnation of the Slavic culture. In the 90s, we lost a major opportunity. That's to say, we could choose among caring about the development of our society, its well-being, or to be again a superpower. We chose the second, and the result of all that is what has so well described Catherine. So the narrative of the Kremlin that encompasses what Catherine has said is filling itself with a parallel reality, a reality that is going to transform the facts the facts that are needed to justify its actions. Not long ago, the only Russian diplomat that has presented his dismissal as his diplomat explained that this system is living within propaganda. It is living with this propaganda. It doesn't need the reality. It exists by itself. So we could also say that this discourse, prevailing discourse, is just like a magical beverage that enables Putin to play with facts and juggle with these facts. So this, where the truth is irrelevant. You don't have to pronounce the word war. You cannot pronounce Alexei Navalny, and on the contrary, pronounce the word special operation. Ukrainians are Nazis. They are the threat for Russia, and reality will be there. So this juggling with reality is built around two mantras. One is focusing on Ukraine and the other one on the NATO, as we are called a collective Western region. The first mantra that is focused on Ukraine, we have to acknowledge that it has worked both in Europe and also outside Europe, both on the left and on the right, outside Russia. And name it the Pope, Lula, Orban, among many others. This mantra is based upon three lies. The first lie, the war was a coup directed by Nazis and the extreme right and promoted by the Western Bloc. The Russian minority is in danger. In Ukraine, it is in danger, and the rights, most particularly the Russian language, are threatened. The third lie, Ukraine has not its own identity as a nation state, because Ukrainian and Belarusian are the same people. We must underline the fact that one of the historic names that given to the Russians to their Slavic neighbors is a small or a big Russian. Russia comes from Belarus as the Ukrainian and the Russian, but here we cannot. This is a debate we cannot held here. So it was called as a. So that's why Russia has to denazify and save the Russian minority in Ukraine the genocide. That's what says Kremlin. But I know that the resistance of the Russian in the east of the country, where this minority prevails, I think that the resistance shows clearly that to what point the reality is far from the Russian prevailing reality. This auto-deceivement that has been, self-deceivement that has been explained by Catherine is one of the assets for the army to act. The Russian and Russo-Ukrainian that were going to receive them for the freedom, thanks to the freedom, and they were mobilizing to fight against this troop and sparing them from all these evils. But they have had a reason, and Russian troops are not aware of that, and this is a weakness for Russia. In Ukraine, the Kremlin that has believed its own lies has clashed against the will of resistance of an actor that was considered inferior, and that on its own it's an humiliation. do not need to care about that. But we have to understand what means Moscow with denazification. It is important to understand it, to know why the Russians are occupying these regions and what are going to lose the Ukrainians if they lose the war. It is important also to understand what we would be accepting for the Ukrainians if we do not support them in all the domains, starting by the military one. Kremlin hasn't given an official version of this concept of this denazification, but some voices are arousing and they are giving us an idea of what is happening. A philosopher, Timothy Joseph, wrote that the last April for information, Russian information press editor, wrote an article. I'm going to read a small extract, and I read it. In April last year, we wrote about the unavoidable denazification of Ukraine. Today, this is a fact, and as such, the denazification of that country cannot be sovereign. The denazificator state, Russia, can't adopt a liberal approach of this denazification, and the name Ukraine cannot be kept as such. The denazification as the aim of this military operation is a military victory on Kiev. The liberation of those subject to denazification, the liberation of the Nazis and the arrest of all those fighting against Russia, and the creation of systemic conditions for its denazification in peace times. So the denazification will be unavoidably de-Ukrainization. And this is the end of the quote. The second mantra that is quite popular in many sectors of the international press is that the guilt is that the NATO is the guilty part. This NATO that is threatening Russia would have broke the promise made by Gorbachev and Mikhail in the February of 1990, and NATO shouldn't go 1 inch to the east, eastward. So, to illustrate many of the contradictions in this narrative of the Kremlin, I will quote an article published in June last year, an article of Putin in the Zeit, where Putin says that many countries have been obliged to choose between aligning with the Western side or Russia. It was an ultimatum. So the idea is that the NATO has presented an ultimatum to the countries that wanted to enter the NATO to choose between Russia and the Western world. And this was supposed to be the spark giving to the war. But Putin contradicts himself, because we know that the enlargement and the NATO took place between 1999 and 2009. But Putin in this same article continues saying that, and I quote, when Europe supported the military coup in Ukraine, that's when all started. So the Russian president is telling us that the reason of the war is not Russia but Ukraine, and it is true because everything started in 2014 when Ukraine started to be freed of Russia. It is dynamic of Ukraine, and Russia is starting to stop with no success. And on the other side, the idea sent by the Kremlin, the idea of the fact that Russia has reacted in such a way because Westerns have pushed her to do that is quite wrong and does not fit with the situation. The European Union and the NATO have described Russia as a strategic partner and never as a enemy, and has always treated Russia with care. And lately they have designed different policies to create a framework of cooperation with Russia. Russia has been admitted in the G7, and also Russia has been helped during the crisis of 1998. The World Bank gave him a loan of $17 billion, and NATO hasn't been saying anything because of the crisis in Chechnya. So the great worry of not bothering Russia has prevailed not only in the relationship with Moscow, but also has had a negative impact on the relationship of the European Union with the rest of the Soviet countries, the Soviet countries. Sorry. So I guess that the self-criticism that should do the NATO and the EU throughout these years of relation with Putin is mostly the fact of having always adapted itself to the interests of Russia and to calm its bad humor, repeating mistakes that took place in 1940 during the Second World War. During the testimony of Gorbachev helps us to shed a different light on what was said at that time. Gorbachev, in October 2014, was interviewed by the media, Russia Beyond the Headlines, an interview where he's asked about this part of the story. Why don't you have reclaimed these promise done by James Baker? And Gorbachev says, and I quote, the enlargement of the NATO wasn't addressed and wasn't mentioned in those years. And I say it with all my responsibility. He says he speaks frankly, and because he knows that what he's saying is not going to be popular among the Kremlin, in the Kremlin. So I quote, "Oh, no Eastern country talked about this after the leaders, the Western leaders, did not even mention it." So we addressed another matter, was to ensure that the military structures of the NATO should not progress, and the armies of the alliances should not deploy themselves in the territory of the RDA. So the east that was mentioned was the east of the future reunified Germany. So the declaration of Becker mentioned in the question was the declaration was made in this context. So now after the now that the great victory is not possible, Kremlin has renovated its narrative with an argument that is focused on the international audience, and the major objective is to go further in these strategies to divide the Western world when talking about the strategies and to spike the increase of the grain prices and the energy prices. Kremlin has seen an opportunity because in the public European debate we are seeing if there's if there is a fatigue in the war. They are discussing about the fact if the war is vanishing or is losing impetus, but we know that Moscow is going to be as toxic as possible to cultivate the division among the member states and poison the public debate within the states. So this idea of this narrative is the following. The increase of the conflict is because of Western world, because they are supporting Ukraine and supporting the suffering, and they are telling that they are not wanting to discuss, and we are a pawn in the hands of the United States, and the EU is dominated by the United States. The states are promoting this war. And this war is it's only serving the interests of Washington and the ones of its industry and defense.
And the third idea is that international public opinion has to take on board the idea that both the Donbass occupation and Crimea annexing are just a fait accompli, and no negotiation will reverse this new status quo. Let's just think that Putin's Russia has spent the last 20 years feeling humiliated. And I say that because in the first 10 years of Yeltsin, there were very few people that spoke about humiliation. It didn't become more frequent until Putin came to power. And Putin associates humiliation to Russians' priority to return to becoming the great power that it should never have stopped being, according to Alexeyevich. Since then, the Kremlin has always taken as a given the predominant power of Russia in the post-Soviet space, as well as the unquestionable legitimacy of its interests in the area. This is where, for Moscow, the core of what they call the question of European security architecture lies. Until Europe recognizes the predominant role of Russia, Russia will never be satisfied and will never consider that it is being treated as an equal, which is what Russia understands when it says that it wants to be treated as an equal. That's why Moscow doesn't believe it's an emerging power, but rather a restored world power, a condition that was taken away from it by the Western powers who made use of that after the Soviet system collapsed. This victim-based view seems to forget that there was no humiliation, and it's just something that comes internally from Russia, from the exhaustion of the development model of the Soviet system itself. If there was any humiliation, it was for internal reasons. Kremlin doesn't want military neutrality in Ukraine. And if you don't believe that, look at the very limited attention that Russia has paid to what Zelensky has said when it said it would be neutral, prepared to be a neutral power. So Russia doesn't want the neutrality of Ukraine, but what it wants to do is to make it possible for all those countries that surround Ukraine, the following of a political project which aspires to construct a rule of war that respects pluralism and all the other basic freedoms. As is being shown by the war that Putin has started against Ukraine, Putin cannot allow Ukraine to set this kind of a precedent because it would prove to the Russian citizens as well that being a Slav doesn't mean that you doesn't predestine you to not being allowed to enjoy the freedoms of democracy. So let's not confuse what Putin fears. Putin doesn't fear Ukraine joining NATO, but a democratic Ukraine. It's been said that a country that doesn't respect the rights of its own citizens will not respect the rights of their neighbors. And to conclude, I just want to say that in my opinion, as Russia has been evolving in the last 20 years, and especially, of course, from 2014 onwards, Moscow's victory would have dramatic consequences, not just for Ukraine and for other former Soviet neighbors, but for everybody. We know that another Putin can appear after this one, and that strengthens my idea that only a military defeat of Russia will contribute to reverse this trend. The French historian Thierry Fonton reminded us recently in Le Figaro that contrary to Nazism, true Nazism, not the one that they say exists in Ukraine, contrary to Nazism, the Soviet system wasn't defeated by weapons. Bolton also highlights how the Nuremberg trials helped German society to free itself from its own devils. I'm convinced that Russia and the Russian people, and I say Russian people from an ethnic viewpoint, not the citizens of other Russian nations. I have the firm conviction that Russia and the Russian people need to go through a similar collective catharsis. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias, Carmen.
Thank you so much, Carmen. You have made quite clear your position. Many of us that are here, when we hear this story of the official Russian narrative that you've just read, I think you've got one by one all the words used by the Cantabrian president when he spoke about the situation of the war in Ukraine. Exactly the same Russian narrative, official narrative that has been reproduced by so many supposedly enlightened people. Let's carry on, because I think we're all very interested in listening to what Andrei has to say, and of course because of his position. And we want to ask you, Andrei,
here today, and thanks for participating. Andrei, how is the situation inside? To which extent can we guess or know what civil society thinks? And what is the foreseeable evolution of the regime, but also of public opinion trends, according to your views? Thank you again, Andrei. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I can't be with you physically. It's a pity. but I hope we'll see each other in the future. You asked also about this question of travel ban, of toughening of the visa regulation. And this is a case in which we can see all the features of the current situation and the features of discussion in Russia. But generally speaking, Europe can't punish this way average Russians, because they don't feel any guilt. Majority. I always speak in terms of majority. It doesn't have any kind of didactic sense, and Europe can't re-educate average Russians in a case of this toughening of the travel or visa regulation, because people are living their own lives. They can't see any kind of responsibility for this war, because they always lived separately from the state. And the war is the problem and the case of the state. Okay, we will support everything which is coming from the very top, but at the same time, we are not responsible for it. Why punish us in that sense? So, but I understand the position primarily of Baltic states, which are too close to Russia geographically. And because of that, they are irritated by this inflow of Russian tourists to their territories, which are using Baltic states as transfer countries. And after that, they go somewhere to the south, to Italy, to Spain, to Greece. And this is not a mass phenomenon, I would say, because only one person from 10 persons can travel. And not all Russians are using such an opportunity as a traveling around Europe, but nevertheless, I understand in that sense how painful the situation is for Baltic states. But at the same time, pro-Western Russians must be distinguished from this mass. Scholars, journalists at risk must be distinguished from this mob. And Europe must understand that pro-Western Russians, democratically oriented Russians, they are Europeans, the same Europeans as people in any other European country, and Europe should not turn its back on them. It's important from the point of view of the future of Russia, of creating a normal, of a high-quality human capital for the future Russia, because Russia will not disappear. We will have to survive this period of Putin, and who will reconstruct the country after Putin? This is a question. And one more important point: Europe must be at least open, in my opinion, to the Russian youth, primarily in terms of education. Again, it's important from the point of view of the quality of the human capital in the future. So I would, I think I will say I will divide into three parts my small report. Yes, I will describe some sentiments of Russians, but if I will have a bit more time, I can describe ideological framework with which Putin works, and the very essence of regime in this landscape. So the main conclusion is that Russia is split. I know that Kremlin and at the same time Western observers, they use this figure 80% of support, but we must dive into details, because inside this big figure of sociology, there are a lot of very different groups of people who are thinking differently. And important point is that Russian society is strongly polarized. There are, in a sense of everyday life, there are a lot of quarrels and conflicts between old friends, between parents and children who are no longer speaking with each other, with conflicts inside married couples, with conflicts between teachers and students who are denouncing each other, just like in Stalinist time. So this is a polarization of the society, and the main point is that this is not only polarization; all these opinions are becoming radicalized from both sides. So we are witnessing a growing conflict within Russian society. Yes, here is a majority which is supporting special operation. As a whole, this is 80%, but these figures are quite stable. From May to June or August, around 50% of Russians definitely support the actions of the Russian army, but another 25-28% said they mostly support the operation. And we must differ this unconditional support, fierce support of the operation, which coincides with the support of Putin, and people who are mostly supporting, who are hesitating, who are trying to follow the official general line, people who don't have their own positions, their own opinions, and they prefer to off these opinions from authorities or from propaganda. So we see that only the half of the population strongly supports the operation. And inside this group, there are some respondents. We convened focus groups with Levada Center, independent pollster, and there are open data also from Levada Center, which is the most trustworthy pollster in Russia. And some respondents, especially women and younger people, they are engaged in a form of self-persuasion. For example, they say there was no choice for Russia, for Putin. You can't be in favor of war, but our soldiers are being killed, and Ukrainian soldiers too, and this is quite bad. But what choice we had? Negotiate with them. It's too late. So this is kind of a dominant sentiment among people who are trying to think about the situation. Another widespread form of this support came from people who are largely indifferent to the situation, but who support the government's actions because they believe the government knows best. Indifference is the best friend of Putin, just like an ignorance. People don't want to know the truth about the special operation. They're blocking bad information because they don't want to be on the side of evil. They don't believe that they are on the side. And this is a normal psychological reaction to the war. They don't dare to name the war by its name. They prefer to name a special military operation. They prefer to think that this is a case for professionals, not for the whole population. And it was a smart step from Putin's side not to announce the general military mobilization, because it could provoke discontent in masses. Quite good that soldiers who are struggling in the fields, they are from poor families. If they sign a contract, they want to get simply money for their service. Some of them didn't know that they will fight in Ukraine and that they can become killers, and they could be killed as well themselves. This is a question of an old story, so-called anticipatory obedience of the majority of the population, not only in Russia, but Russia is a very specific example of this obedience. And maybe this is a case of path dependence, maybe this is a case of a habit to live without the state. This is kind of a social contract. You, the state, you don't interfere into our private life, but we will not interfere in exchange for it in your desire to rule the world, in your desire to initiate any kind of wars and invasions. So we will support it. We will support the idea of the Great Russia, of the making Russia great again, but in exchange for it, you must contribute some food to our tables. And despite the fact that sanctions are working, they are actionable, they have implications, but at the same time, for the moment, Russia has economic resources to survive. And people accept every step downstairs as a kind of a new normal. At least in this year, maybe in the year 2023, we will see another picture. So, as a conclusion, there are two key beliefs that allow respondents to remain convinced that the Russian leadership and military are taking the right action. The first point, that the Russian-speaking population in Ukraine was under threat. We are simply assisting them, and that responsibility for what is happening lies entirely with Russia's adversaries. NATO, United States, collective West, as Putin says, they are responsible for the worsening of the situation in Ukraine, and eastern Ukraine especially, for escalating of the conflict in Donbass. This is not our guilt, so only a very small percentage were prepared to blame the Russian side. So this is all about people who are supporting Putin, and let's talk a bit about the scale of dissent. Currently, around 20%, maybe a bit less, of Russians say they do not agree with Russia's actions in Ukraine. And this is a growing picture, figures. The respondents refer to what is happening as war, not a special operation. They name it Russian aggression. As the majority of them does not support Putin. These people are democratically oriented, and the figure is more or less stable in all the periods of post-Soviet, post-Yeltsin history of Russia, when from 15% to, I don't know, 20% of the population, they are supporting democracy, they are against Putin, and right now they are against the special military operation. To some extent, the situation depends on the sources of information. For sure, people who are using internet, who are using VPN right now, because all the independent sources here are blocked by the authorities, all these people prefer to be against Putin. So if people are using primarily TV, elder generations, they are for Putin. It's explainable, but what is not typical? All recent years, the popularity of television was steadily waning. But from the beginning of the special military operation, television became again the most trustworthy source of the information for Russians. This is something new. And this is because of this situation of misunderstanding what is happening. It was a shock not only for people who are supporting, who do not support Putin, but for people who are supporting Putin strongly. They couldn't understand what has happened, and they were disoriented. They didn't have any kind of their own opinions. And again, they prefer to owe these opinions from television. from opinions of official persons like Putin, like Shoigu, or somebody else, and they feel this magnitude of very, very noisy, let's say, Kremlin talk shows on TV. This is really kind of a hypnosis for a lot of people who are watching TV all the time. And yes, people who are watching primarily internet, Telegram channels are quite important for Russians. Yes, they sometimes do not support the operation, but even in these groups, like inhabitants of big cities, like the youth, even in these groups, the majority is still supporting the operation. I mean, the majority inside these groups. One more feature of public sentiments. So people are perceiving the reality as such, and they perceive the situation as a new normal. People survived the primary shock around May. People generally adapted to the situation, and they are paying less attention to the special military operation, not to mention that summertime without general military mobilization became a time for vacations, a time for a break from bad news, and sociology demonstrates that people are paying less and less attention to the military operation, to military issues, political issues. They're trying to distract themselves. Again, it's explainable. This is a psychological defense, let's say. Yes, we can say that it's horrible that people can feel their collective guilt. They do not follow the news and events to the same extent as it was in the first months. But this is a reality. I think it helps Putin to maintain the high level of support, because he does not intervene strongly into the problems of the population. And this is a bridge to another story. What kind of regime we have right now? Is it an authoritarian regime or hybrid authoritarian regime? Or is it something between authoritarianism and totalitarianism? We know that totalitarianism means the strong mobilization of people. You can't be mute. You must be involved into all the state events, state initiatives, etc., etc. And Putin created this kind of mobilization because of this war. And he tries to maintain a high level of obedience. People must express their support sometimes, especially in a state-dependent organization or budget organizations. And this is a feature of totalitarianism. But why I tend to name this regime as a hybrid totalitarianism, because at the same time, Putin wants demobilization of people, just like this summer. Do not pay a lot of attention to military operation. We are going according to the plan. Everything is okay. Yes, the West is our enemy, and they're trying to spoil our party everywhere. But nevertheless, you are in safety. We will struggle for your personal sovereignty, for the sovereignty of our state. So stay tuned, but we are quite strong and efficient. So demobilize. So this is a mixture of mobilization and the demobilization creates this very strange regime of, let's say, hybrid authoritarianism. And at the same time, Putin, at the very beginning of the operation, he mentioned not for the first time the necessity of the self-cleansing of the society. He mentioned so-called national traitors. He mentioned the fifth column. And he simply appealed to people to maintain the idea of the self-cleansing of the society. And people accepted this idea. And people who are not supporting operation can be labeled as a foreign agents. They can be labeled as people who are violating criminal code in terms of creating fake news about the army and discrediting the army. And there are a lot of criminal cases against this kind of people. And I would say that nearly everyone who is against the special military operation and against Putin himself, they are now in danger in Russia. And the level of toughness, the level of cruelty of this regime is comparable right now with some periods of the Soviet history. This is a reality, and this is the answer to the question why Russians do not initiate rebellion against Putin. It's simply impossible. It's simply dangerous to appear in the streets. It's simply dangerous to activists to go down to the Moscow's metro, because here we see the face recognition system, and you could be arrested even for some time. It's unpleasant if this face recognition system knows you. So, and this is a reality, such an Orwellian reality, if you want. And one of the consequences of all these processes is the wave of denunciations. I mentioned the very specific sphere of education, when professors or teachers are denunciating their pupils or students. It could be visible vice versa. And this is not maybe a mass phenomenon, but it is visible. And students must be very careful in that sense, and professors must be very careful in that sense, because as a sphere of education is very important for Putin, because this is the tool of the indoctrination of the whole nation, indoctrination with Putin's ideology. I have not enough time to describe the whole ideological framework, but I will maybe mention the main of it, the main feature. I mean the idea of empire. Russia is not empire without Ukraine. And maybe this is the main message of Putin to the population. We are the one nation. This is one of the main messages, which is visible right now in eastern Ukraine, in the occupied territories. So Putin never assessed Ukraine as an independent state. He always thought in terms of spheres of interests. Yes, this is archaic way of thinking, but this is a reality. And he never thought about Ukraine as about sovereign state. This territory doesn't have subjectivity, let's say. And it was a theoretical vision from his side, but now he simply implemented this, let's say, ideology, this theory and practice. And he uses all the possible words and some, I don't know, ideology in order to support this idea. For instance, let's take the explanation of this war, of this invasion. The imperialist discourse naturally accompanies the liberation mission of Putin's operation. So liberation of the territories. This is one of the main points in Putin's explanation to the domestic audience why we made this invasion. So he was celebrating this June or July, the anniversary of Peter the Great, and he announced kind of a new motto: returning and strengthening of the territories. This is a liberation of our territories. These territories are not Ukrainian. So this is so-called Russian world, which partly coincides with the canonical territory of the Orthodox Church. So we are returning these territories, we are liberating the population, and we are strengthening economically, morally, these territories. In that sense, the imperialistic discourse is the main point inside this Putin's ideology. So in that sense, what happened was the peak of the collapse of the Soviet Empire in reality. Because the collapse did not end in December 1991, but had just begun. So, having passed through several stages, this drama of the former Soviet Union, of the Soviet Union disruption, played out in Ukraine right now, and we're experiencing the last periods of this drama of the disruption of the Soviet Empire. So, and we have to, let's say, survive this period. And after that, I hope we could think about the future of Russia. Not now, but maybe after the end of this horrible, partly authoritarian, partly totalitarian regime. So I will stop myself here.
Muchísimas gracias, Andrei.
Thank you, Andrei. Thank you very much, Andrei.
Creo que todos coincidimos, ¿no?
I guess we all agree that this situation is terrible. This is quite typical of an authoritarian and totalitarian country. The pressure on the dissidents and the persecution. I guess we will have many questions, and you will be able to discuss with Andrei. We have until 10 to 12, because we will close the session, because today it is the 90 anniversary of the university, the 90 anniversary of the university, and we will have a cocktail served at the building of Las Caballerizas. But first of all, you got a comment, a question for Andrei? Catherine, yours is the floor.
Andrei, thanks, Andrei, for all your comments. Obviously, everyone at the moment is very interested in what happened at the weekend when the daughter of Alexander Dugin had this bomb attack. What's your view of the situation? Do you think it's a sign of some unrest within the Russian elite, or is it impossible to tell, or people, will perhaps parts of the Russian elite now feel that they're not protected by Putin's security state when they see what's happened to Dugin's daughter?
Yes, it's an inevitable question, because this is a really serious event because of the fact that Alexander Dugin himself is a celebrity, a political celebrity. Yes, his role in Russian ideology, his influence on Putin is exaggerated for sure. He has never met Putin at all, but nevertheless, he is a mainstream thinker right now. He was a marginal thinker several years ago, but now he's in the very center of Putin's ideology. And yes, I think that Dugin himself was the goal of terrorists or FSB, if FSB orchestrated this assassination. And but it's evident that Daria Dugina, his daughter, became an accidental. It was as a result of the war. I mean, she was kind of a soldier who was killed during this war because she deeply supported the ultra-conservative discourse of his father, and she supported the special military operation, and she tried to become to become a public figure in this field. So there are different versions. The official version of FSB is that this is the act of Ukrainian special services, and in one day they found a killer, a woman who crossed the border of Russia, then killed Daria Dugina, and then left Russia to Estonia. It looks implausible, for people who are thinking a bit about the circumstances of this assassination. I think it was a kind of it could be a provocation of FSB in order to get more hate reaction from people who are supporting the idea of more aggressive war. Look, they're killing our people on our own territory, and because of that, we must be more cruel, more aggressive in military fields. Let's make a takeover of Kiev, etc., etc. At the same time, this is a signal for more cruel and tough repressions against internal enemies. So look, they are among us. They're killing patriots, so let's expel all of them, let's arrest all of them, etc., etc. I don't know how it will work in reality, to what extent it will influence the rate of repressions. Don't think that it can influence seriously this rate, because repressions live their own life. They will the Kremlin will continue repressions, not paying too much attention to assassinations or events of this kind. But nevertheless, this event provoked a wave of language of hatred among the supporters of Putin. This is really true, and this is a bad sign as well. So, like this.
Okay, thank you so much. Tenemos un espacio.
I think we have some time for questions in the room. There's a question at the back. We have 3 questions, so yours is the floor. Please be brief. Can you please first introduce yourself? Thank you. And stand up. Thank you.
A question to Andrei, I guess, regarding regional differences inside of Russia or ethnic differences regarding the attitude toward the war, because soldiers are coming, I guess, from more peripheral communities. Are there difference of appreciation regarding to Petersburg, St. Petersburg or Moscow? In this area, because there are more dead people and so on.
Okay. De acuerdo. Luego por aquí teníamos una dama que.
We've got a lady there. Another question. I have a question for Andrei. The Western world, mostly in the 90s, has been maybe provoking with the welfare state this war of Putin. Maybe it's just a provocation. And Echevarria, I'm a member of the Senate. I have a question for Belton, but also for the other 2 speakers. A lot has been said, and you have talked about the studies about the psychological capacity of Vladimir Putin. In February, when this war started, it was mentioned that Putin was mad. Is it true? Thank you. Another question, maybe? Please introduce yourself. Thank you. Good morning and congratulations to the three speakers of the panel. I wanted to underline something that has been mentioned by the speakers, and it is related to the origin of the conflict of 2014. The independence referendum of Ukraine, and is going to celebrate to the 25th of August this independence declaration. The declaration took place on the 1st of December of 1991. The conversation of Gorbachev at that time they were recorded, and we were well aware of this act. This could have an impact on the other Soviet countries, and maybe this fact has this fact that from the 1st of December, and it was maybe that at the time we thought that Ukraine was sparking or was the cause of this attack. In autumn of 2004, the Orange Revolution, that was a failure, was also an important step forward. And that time there was a harsh critic against the democratization attempts on behalf of Ukraine. And these are three questions in one. It's a bit too much. So can I finish? Yes, of course, if you are brief. So I want to say that together with the ABC correspondent in Moscow, I had a book that I wanted to present it to the diplomat school in January 2017. It was being presented. It was going to be presented by José Borrell. This diplomatic school, did not agree, because the reason was that there was another book, and this book wasn't going to be well seen or acknowledged by Putin. So thank you for this anecdote. There's
differences which I think can be paired with a reflection maybe on why the body bags are not having an impact if you know the losses of the war are very spread and scattered in different regions. So that question for you, Andrei, briefly, please. And then there is a question for Catherine on Belton, on Belton, not crazy, sorry, not you, Putin being a madman or not. And then a short, I think, very difficult to deal with question going back to history and the referendum on Ukraine. Thank you. Andrei, please.
Yes, these public sentiments, they do not, they couldn't be influenced by the ethnic differences, as I understood properly the question, ethnic differences in Russia, despite the fact that people from ethnic republics are fighting in Ukraine right now, I mean soldiers and officers. And it is visible, but I would stress the fact that these regions are poor regions. And we can say about regional differences in incomes more than about ethnic differences in attitudes towards the war. And the same story with this attitude towards the war. Regional differences are not so significant if we compare it to the differences in the consumption of the information. If you use internet, if you use VPN, you think differently from people who are supporting the war. So the main points in that sense, so the question was about losses, and I would say that people are trying, the majority of people are trying not to not to think about it, to block this information. They don't know the real rate of losses in Russia, which are very higher, and the speed is more significant than during Afghanistan war. But if you'll mention any kind of figures in a public environment, you will be persecuted, because the losses is one of the main painful problem for the authorities right now.
Then Catherine, please.
Yeah, I think, of course, Putin was not mad when he launched the war. He was acting according to his own logic. He had lost an avenue for political control over Ukraine, so he launched quite a desperate gambit, perhaps, but it was one based on a misperception, a misinformation that Zelensky would crumble at the first sight of military might. We all know the reports that the Russian soldiers who were sent in were not prepared to wage a long war, that some of them came with military parade uniforms because they were ready for Kiev to fall within 3 days. It was also based perhaps on a misperception that the West would not be united in the face of such a threat, that the West too would crumble in its resolve and its support for Ukraine. But unfortunately, since presented with not only the resolve of Zelensky, but also of the West, Putin has switched tactics. As we know, he is a master tactician, if not a strategist, and he still sees opportunity in this, in the rising energy prices, in the potential for global food crisis. He still believes that he can outlast the West in trying to kind of take over Ukraine, which he still sees as Russia's historical birthright, that this is part of the Russian Empire and that he has to continue to act.
Y Carmen, sé que has hablado de el ensayo.
Carmen, you have been talking about the problem of Putin. To answer to Jesus, when we say that everything started in 2014, that it is something repeated by Putin and Lavrov and some others, it is clear that this process starts before and starts with the independence declaration in the year 1991. This independence declaration of Ukraine, and the fact that we already knew that the Ukrainians were going to vote in favor of independence, including in Crimea. Crimea had a smaller majority, but it was also voted. Crimea also voted in favor of its independence from Russia. Even the Russian Democrats were surprised and shocked when they knew that Ukraine wanted to make itself independent. But Russia has had to adapt itself to this new situation. And it is true that Ukraine, that is formerly independent, but in practice, its links and also the political influence in Moscow through its oligarch system was still there. So the great shock starts in 2014 with the Orange Revolution and the period of Putin. And the Orange Revolution was a kind of rehearsal, failed rehearsal, because the government of this revolution was not ready, and the pro-Russian government took over the power. But in 2015, it started because the hope of the Kremlin was fully convinced about the fact that Ukraine, and in 2014, Ukraine was a failed state. This hasn't been checked in practice, because not only this state has crumbled, but has not crumbled, but has reinforced itself and has had the support of its people and has had different options that have been materialized through different elections since 2014. So this is something that for the Kremlin was unbearable, apart from other factors that have contributed in the decision to enter the country. Thank you very much. Thank you to the interpreters, the technicians, and the participants and speakers. Andrei, thank you for your participation. Big round of applause. Thank you.